Under the pale early morning sun, the quiet cul-de-sac of Windsor Pines looked like a picture from a real estate brochure. The hedges were trimmed to perfection, each lawn neatly lined like a golf course, and not a single trash bin stood out of place. It was the kind of suburban peace that some would pay anything for. And to Michael Barlow, it was nothing more than a calculated compromise. He hadn't moved here for peace. He didn't need neighborhood block parties or friendly exchanges about lawn fertilizer. He bought the house for one reason. His wife wanted to feel safe, and Windsor Pines sold safety in monthly dues and manicured hedges. Michael wasn't the kind of man to wax sentimental. He was precise, practical, and dangerously good at reading people. Skills sharpened not by drama or loss, but by decades of quietly managing risks others didn't see coming. A man who read user agreements before clicking accept, who reviewed every clause in a mortgage twice, and who bought a dash cam not because he expected trouble, but because he didn't trust people not to lie when it arrived. He wasn't paranoid, just prepared, and yet even someone like Michael had a soft spot. His truck. A brand-new, deep graphite Ford F-250, gleaming under the driveway floodlights like a monument to restraint finally rewarded. He didn't buy it impulsively. He'd spent 3 years watching models, calculating resale values, and waiting for the exact moment when the price-to-feature ratio made sense. When it arrived, he'd spent a week installing upgrades himself. Smart GPS, bed lighting, reinforced toolbox mounts, and custom floor liners with industrial-grade grip. To him, it wasn't just a truck. It was the one selfish decision he'd allowed himself in years. Not flashy, not ridiculous, just solid, built with purpose, and unmistakably his. Not everyone appreciated that. His next-door neighbor, Karen Whitlow, had made her opinion known before Michael had even signed the closing documents on the house. A tall, wiry woman with the posture of a retired ballerina and the permanent frown of someone who took personal offense at low water pressure, she had been a fixture on the neighborhood committee for over a decade. She liked her street's uniform, her neighbors obedient, and her property values rising in quiet, monotonous harmony. The first time they spoke, Karen had ambushed Michael outside his garage under the pretense of welcoming him to the neighborhood. She wore a salmon-colored blouse tucked too tightly into cream slacks and carried a clipboard, as if she'd mistaken her own front yard for a boardroom. "I noticed the truck," she said, after pleasantries that lasted less than 20 seconds. "Are you planning to keep that parked in the driveway? It's just large, and Windsor Pines has a look we try to preserve." Michael didn't answer immediately. He'd already heard about Karen through the real estate agent who had warned him, in guarded, legally non-liable terms, that some residents took their community guidelines very seriously. Michael gave her a small, polite smile and said, "It's my property. I plan to treat it with respect. That includes the truck." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Of course. I just thought it might be something you hadn't considered. We're a tight-knit group here, and aesthetics really do matter. People notice things." Michael nodded slowly. "People always do." That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, there'd been little interaction. Karen walked her dog, an anxious golden doodle named Marbles, twice a day and made a point of pausing for extra long stares at Michael's driveway. She brought up his name during an open committee meeting, suggesting a new conversation around driveway usage be added to the agenda. He knew it wasn't about him personally. People like Karen didn't see individuals. They saw variables, deviations, threats to order. Michael hadn't pushed back. He didn't file counter-complaints. He didn't escalate. He had no interest in neighborhood wars. But every time Karen passed his driveway and gave that look, that barely hidden grimace of disdain, a part of him filed it away. The same way he had cataloged red flags in contracts and inconsistencies in audit reports for years. Quietly, thoroughly. Then came the Monday morning incident. Michael opened the front door with coffee in hand as usual. The air was crisp and faintly damp from overnight sprinklers. But something was off. His truck wasn't gleaming. The windshield was cracked across the center, spiderwebbed like a fractured screen. The front fender had a dent big enough to disrupt the panel line, and along the passenger side, a jagged scrape ran the length of the door, deep enough to expose metal. He stopped mid-step. His first reaction wasn't shock or even rage. It was analysis. The damage wasn't from a falling branch or a stray ball. It was from impact. Low, precise, angled. And the scratch wasn't a brush-by. It had intent. He walked around the truck slowly, kneeling to examine the tire tracks on the wet concrete. They were faint, but visible. There was a drag line from where the wheel had pivoted hard, possibly a reverse turn, maybe from someone misjudging a backup or overcorrecting. Karen's driveway was directly across the street. Michael stood up and scanned the quiet cul-de-sac. The other houses were still. Sprinklers hissed mechanically. He could smell cut grass and exhaust. He walked back inside and placed his coffee on the counter without drinking it. Then he pulled out his phone. Not to film, not to rant, but to begin a process. He started by calling the non-emergency line for the local sheriff's department. Calmly, he explained the damage, requested a report, and asked that an officer visit to file a formal statement. Next, he called his insurance company and began documenting everything they needed. He didn't knock on Karen's door. He didn't post on neighborhood forums. He didn't theorize aloud, because Michael knew that in places like Windsor Pines, accusation without structure was noise. But paperwork? That was pressure. When the officer arrived 40 minutes later, Michael was ready with photos, timestamps, and a written statement. The officer, a polite man in his 40s, took everything down, walked around the vehicle, and nodded appreciatively at the precision of Michael's notes. "If there's any chance someone nearby caught this on camera," the officer said, "we can request footage through official channels. It's voluntary, but people tend to cooperate more with a badge involved." Michael didn't respond directly, but he already knew the answer. Karen had recently installed a new camera above her garage. He'd seen the technician out there on a ladder, heard the casual small talk about blind spots and motion zones. He also knew Karen was meticulous. She didn't install things for decoration. That camera worked, and it pointed almost directly at his driveway. He didn't go to her house. Instead, he listed it in the police report as a potential source of footage. When the officer asked if he'd spoken to her yet, Michael shook his head. "I prefer to let the process play out." The officer nodded. Probably wise. That afternoon, Michael walked out to check his mailbox. As he did, he saw Karen across the street, watering her hanging plants. She didn't look at him, but her dog barked at the sight of his shadow, and she gave a short, sharp tug on the leash. Michael looked down at the bright orange notice in his mailbox. It was an administrative warning. Someone had filed a complaint that his truck was obstructing visibility at the cul-de-sac bend. The fine print cited a rarely invoked clause buried deep in the neighborhood's handbook. No name on the complaint. But none was needed. Michael folded the paper neatly, walked back inside, and sat at his desk. He opened his drawer and pulled out the original printed copy of the community handbook, highlighted, tabbed, and notated with colored flags. His thumb slid to Section 6, Conduct, Claims, and Counterclaims. And then he started reading, not out of panic, not out of rage, but because it was time to use the system she worshipped more than anyone. Not emotionally, not explosively, precisely. It was Tuesday afternoon when Michael received the first response from the insurance company. The adjuster, efficient and neutral in tone, confirmed the damage was indeed consistent with vehicle impact. What stood out most, however, was the note attached at the end. Based on your documentation and preliminary analysis, this may qualify as an intentional act. Please be advised that such cases may involve local law enforcement follow-up. Michael read the email twice, closed his laptop, and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't surprised by the conclusion, but the phrasing made it clear. This wasn't going to fade quietly. It was no longer just about repair bills and surface scratches. It had become a question of intent, and intent had consequences. The next morning, as the sun was beginning to bleach the edges of the neighborhood in that blinding early light Windsor Pines was known for, Michael heard the doorbell. He opened it to find Officer Reed, the same man who had taken the original report, standing with a clipboard and a firm, measured look. "Morning, Mr. Barlow. Just wanted to follow up." Michael gestured him inside. Over coffee at the kitchen island, Reed explained that they had begun requesting voluntary access to nearby home security footage. Most neighbors had either agreed or claimed their systems didn't store more than 24 hours. One household hadn't responded at all. Michael didn't need to ask which. The officer sighed. "We can't compel her without a warrant, and frankly, the department doesn't prioritize property damage unless it escalates. But we'll document the refusal. It's not nothing." Michael nodded, appreciating the frankness. "She's clever. She won't hand it over if she knows what's on it." Reed didn't disagree. "I've seen it before. People weaponize silence." Later that afternoon, a second envelope arrived in Michael's mailbox. This one wasn't from the insurance company or the police. It was from the neighborhood association. Inside was a typed letter, thin, sharp in tone, and drowning in faux civility. The subject line read, "Notice of Violation. Property Usage Guidelines." According to the letter, Michael's truck was now being investigated for violating visibility standards and contributing to vehicular congestion at the cul-de-sac's end. The violation carried a formal warning and a pending review that could result in fines or loss of driveway privileges as outlined under Section 5.4. Michael scanned the page, recognizing the legal padding and bureaucratic threat for what it was, a coordinated strike dressed in paper and signatures. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he retrieved his copy of the handbook again and read through Section 5.4 in full. Nowhere did it mention the ability to revoke driveway usage based on a neighbor's discomfort. What it did say was that repeated false claims made by residents could activate a clause allowing for review of their own status in the community's governance system, including their dues, voting rights, and committee privileges. That clause was obscure, nestled deep in an appendix, and written in the kind of vague language most people skipped. But Michael didn't skip. He tabbed the page, marked the date, and opened a new document on his computer. Pattern of False Claims. Resident K.W. 2 days passed with no word from Karen, no note of apology, no awkward half-wave from across the street. But something else happened. A minor event, easy to miss unless you were watching. One morning, as Michael took out the trash, he noticed the sprinkler system across the road running far longer than usual. Water flowed past Karen's curb, down the gentle slope of the street, and pooled at the bend near his driveway. He walked over, not out of confrontation, but observation. Sure enough, the water had reached the tires of his truck, washing over the edge of the concrete and leaving the area slick. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look toward Karen's house. Instead, he walked back inside, checked the local water use code in the neighborhood documents, and took 3 photos from different angles. 1 hour later, he emailed the water department, not to complain, but to inquire whether runoff concerns had been recently addressed in community inspections. Subtle, clean, untraceable. The following afternoon, Michael's security light flickered on just after sunset. It was motion-triggered, set to respond only when someone entered the defined perimeter around his driveway. He checked the footage later that night and found what he suspected, a brief blur of movement at the edge of the frame. Not enough to identify anyone, but enough to confirm that someone had stepped close enough to trigger the sensor. The timing was precise, just late enough that no one else was out walking, just early enough to avoid suspicion. Michael adjusted the camera angle by 3 degrees and raised the resolution settings. He didn't alert anyone, he simply prepared. Then came the landscaping citation. A formal letter arrived claiming Michael's bushes were encroaching on shared walking paths, even though his property had no such paths. It was yet another baseless claim, filed anonymously, but the wording betrayed familiarity with past violations. Michael recognized the phrasing. It matched language Karen had used in a community meeting weeks ago when she proposed stricter landscape conformity standards. That was when he realized this wasn't just pushback. It was strategy, a layered, methodical campaign to discredit, frustrate, and isolate him. He wasn't being accused. He was being baited. Rather than react, Michael documented everything. Timestamps, letters, citations, screenshots. He created a digital folder, updated daily. He spoke to his insurance adjuster again, who offered him the contact of a legal liaison often used in complex claims involving community governance issues. Michael scheduled a call. The attorney, a sharp, dry-voiced woman named Eleanor, listened without interruption, then asked just one question. "Do you believe this neighbor of yours is trying to establish a pattern of friction for legal leverage, or simply harassing you into compliance?" Michael paused. "Both," he said finally, "and she's doing it through the system she claims to uphold." Eleanor hummed. "Good answer. That means we treat her as a procedural actor, not a personal one, which means the rules can be used both ways." She instructed him to begin compiling a chronological file of every contact point, no matter how small. "I'll review them under HOA countermeasure provisions." This might fall under a misuse clause. If it does, there's precedent for dues reassessment. Not commonly enforced, but available. That night, Michael stood in his driveway with his arms folded, the wind cool and clean against his skin. Across the street, Karen's porch light was off, but he knew she was home. Her blinds were drawn. Her house was silent, but silent wasn't harmless. Silent was strategic. And he realized then that this wasn't just about a truck or a cracked windshield. It was a pressure test, a subtle war between process and personality. And she had expected him to break, to retreat, to make noise and get himself removed. But instead, he was documenting, calculating, letting the system breathe in all the oxygen it needed, until it turned back on her. The next morning, Michael filed a formal petition to the neighborhood board, not as a complaint, but as a procedural inquiry. He referenced obscure sections of the community bylaws, requested clarification on selective enforcement patterns, and asked for public records of disciplinary citations issued in the last year. He didn't mention Karen's name, but her signature was on several of those reports. And as per the rules, any board member associated with complaints under review would be temporarily suspended from voting. Michael didn't file a claim. He started a freeze, a pause in her influence, a forced silence. That night his truck sat under the lights, freshly washed, gleaming again. Not defiant, not protected, just present. And in the darkened house across the street, a woman stood behind a curtain, watching the only man on her block who hadn't blinked. By the end of the week, the stillness that once defined Windsor Pines had begun to take on a different texture. Not the serene quiet of suburban calm, but a waiting kind of silence, like the breath held before a storm. The neighborhood board had acknowledged Michael's inquiry without challenge, confirming the initiation of a procedural review. They included a formal letter assuring him of their dedicated attention to equitable application of community guidelines, and stated that his questions regarding citation frequency, origin, and pattern were valuable to improving transparency. It was the kind of language that sounded neutral on the surface but hinted at institutional defensiveness beneath. Karen, once a near-permanent fixture on the sidewalks and porches, had become conspicuously scarce, as if retreating behind the safety of her blinds until the temperature of the situation could be reassessed. Michael, meanwhile, didn't shift course. He remained quiet, measured, and methodical. But beneath that calm exterior, his pace had picked up. He was no longer responding. He was preparing. On a cool Friday morning, Michael received a notification from the county assessor's office confirming receipt of his public records request. They attached a partial report showing that in the previous 6 months, 9 citations for minor violations had been issued on the street, and 6 of them had originated from the same email address, k.whitlow@windsorpins.org. The violations ranged from non-compliant curbside vegetation to excessive tire residue, all of which had been documented with photographs submitted from the same vantage point, Karen's front lawn. What caught Michael's attention wasn't the content of the complaints, but their consistency. Each one was filed precisely at 6:45 a.m., often within minutes of each other on Mondays. Karen wasn't just filing complaints. She had built a system, a personal ritual of early morning enforcement. It was obsessive, predictable, and vulnerable. Michael shared this pattern with Eleanor, the attorney, who responded almost immediately. "This fits the profile of targeted harassment through procedural overload," she wrote. "There's a legal strategy for this. It's called tactical countersaturation. You mirror the volume, but with legitimacy." That night, Michael began filing a series of structured concerns. Not complaints, but formal observations submitted to the neighborhood board under the clauses related to safety, fairness, and infrastructure. Integrity, he flagged overwatering and sidewalk slippage, unlicensed exterior lighting modifications, improper yard drainage leading to street pooling, and unapproved decorative installations that conflicted with neighborhood uniformity guidelines. Every observation was documented, cited, time-stamped, and framed not as an attack, but as a concern for community integrity. Eleanor described it perfectly. You're not fighting. You're aligning. You're forcing them to either enforce consistently or expose their bias. By Monday, the board was drowning in reports. They issued an emergency meeting notice to review increased correspondence volume. And within 24 hours, 3 neighborhood representatives made a surprise visit to Karen's property. Michael didn't see what was said, but he noticed the tightening of her mouth when they left. The next morning, the decorative lighting on her pergola was gone, and the overgrown vines that had crept past her side gate had been hacked down unevenly, as if removed in haste. She still hadn't spoken a word to him, but the sound of her pruning shears, frantic and repetitive, said enough. Then came the retaliation. It started with an anonymous note taped to Michael's garage, printed in bold type, with no signature. "You are being watched. This isn't your playground." Michael peeled the paper off silently, his expression unreadable. He made no comment, didn't call the board, didn't tell Eleanor, not yet. Instead, he checked his security footage. The camera picked up the movement at 3:07 a.m. A figure in dark clothing, with a baseball cap pulled low, moved across his driveway, fast and tight to the wall. The image was blurred, but the frame rate captured enough to show posture, gait, body type. It wasn't a teenager, it was an adult, purposeful, practiced. Michael quietly upgraded his perimeter system the next day, installing 2 motion-triggered auxiliary lights angled toward the sides of the garage and integrating infrared backup with time-stamped alerts. He also installed a backup power unit, knowing full well that local lines could be conveniently interrupted by someone with influence. These weren't reactions out of fear. They were strategic installations, preemptive answers to a problem not yet voiced. He was turning his house into a fortress, not because he was paranoid, but because he refused to be cornered by someone who believed subtle pressure and indirect control would break him. But Karen wasn't finished. One morning, Michael discovered a formal petition left at his doorstep. It was a request signed by 4 households urging the board to re-examine his truck's compliance with updated community visual standards. The language was suspiciously bureaucratic, echoing wording used in older neighborhood newsletters, but with slightly modified phrasing. He noticed one oddity. 2 of the signatories were out of town for the entire month, as per the association's newsletter. When Michael followed up through a polite email, one responded immediately, baffled. "We never signed anything. We wouldn't. We like your truck." Michael forwarded that email to Eleanor, who replied, "Perfect, now we have forgery. At minimum, procedural misrepresentation. It's enough to trigger the misuse clause." The clause in question had rarely been invoked. It allowed for disciplinary reassessment of a resident's standing in the community governance system if they were found to have manipulated or falsified procedural records. The consequence wasn't criminal, but it was financial. The resident could be subject to a dues reassessment multiplier, and their committee eligibility would be suspended for 1 calendar year. For someone like Karen, who thrived on control through structure, it was a strategic decapitation. Michael didn't deliver the email directly to the board. He sent it through Eleanor's office, with an accompanying memo outlining the violation and citing prior precedents in adjacent communities. The board, clearly uncomfortable, issued a temporary freeze on all committee matters involving Karen Whitlow pending a formal review. Her email access was suspended, her ability to submit citations revoked, and her complaint record placed under third-party audit. Michael received no public apology, no acknowledgement, but he noticed that for the first time since he moved in, the cul-de-sac felt still, not tense, not silent from hostility, silent from recalibration. And yet, even as the tide turned, Michael remained vigilant. He didn't celebrate. He knew that someone like Karen wouldn't vanish. She'd wait. She'd pivot. People like her didn't need power. They needed the illusion of control. And when it slipped from their hands, they didn't collapse. They adapted. She would find another way back in, another tactic, another vector. But this time, Michael had a map. 2 weeks passed without incident, at least on the surface. The procedural freeze placed on Karen's neighborhood privileges had created an eerie vacuum in Windsor Pines, a quiet pocket of suspended tension. Michael could feel the change in rhythm, not because people started speaking to him more, but because the strategic silence had stopped. No new notices in the mailbox, no citations slipped under the door, no odd stares from across the street while he watered the lawn. Karen's house looked the same from a distance, but up close something had shifted. The flower beds were no longer symmetrical, the lawn had a few missed edges, and the little decorative mailbox topper she was known for, an iron cardinal, had vanished. It wasn't neglect, exactly. It was the absence of discipline, of that obsessive touch that once defined every square foot of her domain. Michael noticed, filed it mentally, and kept going. But systems, especially fragile suburban ones, rarely stay neutral for long. It was on a Thursday morning when the board sent out its monthly bulletin, and tucked away at the end, past reminders about pool hours and recycling guidelines, was a single line that caught Michael's attention. Resident-initiated citations will now require second-party verification before issuance. The rule was presented as a procedural improvement, but he knew it was a direct consequence of Karen's forgery scandal. It was a win, albeit a quiet one. Yet it came with something else, a sense that she would not accept this shift passively. She had been stripped of her primary weapon. control through process. And when someone like Karen loses institutional power, they turn to more personal tools. That evening, Michael received a call from Eleanor. Her tone was calm but focused. "Michael," she began, "we got a letter from the regional office of the Neighborhood Management Group. Someone submitted a grievance against you. Not a formal complaint, but a grievance hearing request, alleging behavioral hostility and community destabilization." Michael narrowed his eyes, immediately understanding the move. A grievance wasn't the same as a rule violation. It was opinion-based, subjective, rooted in perception. And worst of all, it could be made by anyone, not just residents. All it needed was emotion and ambiguity. "What does that mean for me legally?" he asked. Eleanor replied, "Nothing yet, but it creates administrative noise. It repositions you as a disruptor, and that's dangerous in these structures. It changes how your actions are interpreted, even if the facts stay the same." The grievance accused Michael of cultivating an adversarial atmosphere and intimidating neighbors through excessive surveillance. It referenced his camera, installations, the positioning of his truck near intersections, and his pattern of hyper-formal documentation. It even suggested that several unnamed neighbors felt psychologically uncomfortable. There was no evidence, no dates, no specifics, just an abstract narrative meant to muddy the waters. Michael wasn't surprised, but he was irritated. Not because the attack had arrived, but because of how calculated it was. Karen had moved the fight out of procedural lanes and into the realm of perception, where clarity was weaker and truth harder to defend. Eleanor advised him to respond once, clearly and calmly, and let her firm handle any follow-up. "You don't argue with fog," she said. "You just anchor yourself and let it pass. If you push back emotionally, they'll twist it into proof." Michael agreed. He sent a short statement affirming his adherence to all community guidelines, emphasizing his limited interactions, and noting that all surveillance equipment was installed in compliance with local law and placed solely for personal security. He didn't reference Karen by name, but the implication was clear. He wasn't destabilizing anything. He was defending himself, quietly, within the rules. Still, the grievance cast a shadow. He began noticing subtle changes. Neighbors who once nodded now looked down when passing. A couple that used to walk their dog near his driveway changed their route. It wasn't overt hostility. It was social drift, engineered carefully. Karen was leveraging ambiguity, using implication to frame Michael as the problem without ever taking direct action. He couldn't counter it with data or footage. It was a battle of narratives now, and that required a different strategy, one he hadn't planned on needing. Then, one evening, the strategy came to him. While reviewing archived neighborhood meeting notes from a year earlier, notes Karen had once helped draft, Michael discovered something overlooked. A bylaw revision Karen had pushed through during her time on the board expanded the penalty scope for misuse of water systems, citing flooding risk and property value damage. She had used it to reprimand a family 2 houses down for a broken irrigation valve, but the clause had never been rescinded, and it applied to runoff and artificial pooling from overwatering, including intentional misdirection of drainage. Michael remembered the incident with his flooded sidewalk, the way water had crept under his truck, the sprinklers running far longer than standard timers would allow. He hadn't acted on it then. Now it was ammunition. Hers, used against others, now turned inward. He logged the incident officially, this time citing the bylaw revision by number, attaching photos, including timestamps and elevation slope diagrams from a simple laser-level app. Eleanor reviewed the draft and nodded. "This is a legitimate violation. We'll send it as a community concern, not a complaint. Let them investigate. If they don't, that's neglect. If they do, she's exposed. Within a week, a neighborhood inspector, someone Karen used to direct, arrived with a clipboard and a leveler of his own. He spent 15 minutes at her curb. Then he left without knocking. The following day, a maintenance crew arrived and replaced part of the sidewalk near Karen's runoff zone with non-slip texture coating. The neighborhood issued a statement calling it a routine safety improvement. But Michael knew better. It was damage control. Quiet, minimal, but meaningful. Karen's influence was still present, but it had been reduced to whispers and backdoor requests. Her power no longer came from policy. It came from spite and suggestion. But suggestion has limits. It cannot withstand sustained contradiction. And Michael wasn't just contradicting. He was redefining. That night, he stood outside again, watching the motion lights flicker off, feeling the air shift with the season. Autumn was close. The evenings were colder, the shadows longer, and for the first time since this started, he no longer felt like he was defending himself. He was shaping the battlefield. The first sign that things were about to escalate came not through a letter or a knock on the door, but from the sudden absence of predictability. For weeks, Karen's behavior had followed a pattern: measured silence, indirect pressure, weaponized bureaucracy, but now that pattern was gone. She had disappeared from her usual morning patrols. Her car remained in the driveway longer into the day, and her porch light, which had once flicked on precisely at sunset, now stayed off well into the night. It wasn't retreat. It was recalibration, and Michael recognized the silence for what it was, a signal that the next move would not come through channels, but through disruption. He adjusted accordingly. His security system was now layered with overlapping motion fields. The lighting across his property was redesigned for maximum coverage without drawing attention. He trained himself to check small details: mailbox positioning, tire tracks on his driveway, the angle of his garbage bin lid. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, driven by the certainty that someone who had spent years mastering control wouldn't give it up without deploying everything she had left. And then, on a Thursday morning, just past 8, as Michael returned from the hardware store with replacement parts for a motion sensor mount, he noticed something peculiar. A blue sedan, unfamiliar, was parked near the cul-de-sac entrance. It didn't belong to any resident he recognized. It was positioned awkwardly, halfway between two driveways with the engine running. As he pulled into his own driveway, he saw the passenger window roll down, and a man stepped out with a camera and clipboard. The man approached the nearest house, not Karen's, but her neighbor, and began taking photos of the lawn, siding, even the gutters. Michael observed from his porch as the man repeated this process with the next house, then the next, skipping only Karen's. By the time he reached Michael's property line, Michael walked out to meet him. "May I help you?" he asked, not unkindly. The man introduced himself as a field inspector for a private property management firm, contracted by the homeowner's oversight committee for a routine visual compliance check. Michael asked for identification, which the man provided, valid but vague, issued from an LLC in a neighboring county. Michael studied it for a long moment, then nodded and allowed the man to proceed, silently noting every angle and photo taken. Later that day, Michael called the neighborhood board chair directly, a man named Jared he had only spoken to once before. Michael kept the conversation short, factual, and polite. Jared sounded caught off guard, admitted no knowledge of a scheduled inspection, and promised to look into it. Less than 2 hours later, Michael received a follow-up email from Jared stating that no such inspection had been authorized, and that the board had not contracted any third-party evaluators this quarter. That evening, Michael sent Eleanor the inspection footage from his security system. She replied instantly, Unauthorized access under the guise of compliance review is a direct violation of community policy. If Karen coordinated this, she's breached her suspension terms. That's enforceable. 3 days passed, then came the letter. Folded neatly in an envelope with no return address, it was slipped into Michael's front door frame during the early hours of the morning. He found it while collecting the newspaper. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed, no handwriting, with the following message: "Let it go, or the board won't be your only problem." It was unsigned, unmarked, but the wording was deliberate. Oh, it wasn't a threat of violence. It was a threat of escalation beyond the community level, the kind of language that suggested legal entanglements, reputational smearing, or both. Michael scanned the note, filed it, and said nothing. He didn't call the police. He didn't forward it to the board. He sent it directly to Eleanor, who instructed him to start preparing a protective countermeasure dossier, not to use immediately, but to have in place should things move into formal legal harassment territory. And then, like clockwork, the campaign resumed. Within 48 hours, Michael received back-to-back notices, one alleging that his security lighting exceeded lumens allowed by code, and the second accusing him of discharging hazardous fluids onto the street, specifically runoff from truck detailing. Both claims were demonstrably false. His lighting was within the manufacturer's regulated limits, and his truck detailing used eco-friendly biodegradable soaps, contained by runoff mats he had installed personally. He photographed everything, time-stamped it, and forwarded the documentation not to the board this time, but to the community insurance liaison. This was a strategic pivot. By involving the insurance compliance office directly, he was moving the problem outside the closed loop of neighborhood politics. The response was swift. A representative arrived for a walk-through inspection the next day and filed an internal notice that no violations existed and that the complaints lacked material basis. What mattered more was the language used in their summary. Complaints appear to originate from a pattern of targeted scrutiny, not objective observation. This phrase, while innocuous on paper, carried weight, especially if repeated in future legal filings. Karen, meanwhile, returned to visibility, but in a different form. She wasn't standing on sidewalks anymore. She was sending proxies. Over the next week, Michael observed at least 3 different individuals, neighbors with only tangential connections to her, begin expressing sudden concern about changes in community tone. One hosted a backyard meeting to discuss improving neighbor communication. Another posted anonymously on the community message board about residents who bring legal threats into friendly disputes. The posts were vague, heavy with implication, and strategically timed. They didn't mention names, but everyone knew who they were about. Michael ignored them, but Eleanor advised him to archive each post with metadata, screenshots, and IP traceable information. When they can't prove you're wrong, she said, they try to prove you're disliked, and that matters in arbitration. And then came the deliberate provocation. One night, just after midnight, a rock hit Michael's fence. Not large enough to break anything, but loud enough to startle. Then another. The security footage caught a silhouette sprinting away. No clear identity, but the behavior was unmistakably juvenile. It could have been kids, but nothing in Windsor Pines happened without someone directing it. Michael reported the incident through official channels, not to press charges, but to establish precedent. The sheriff's deputy who responded was the same officer who had taken his original truck damage report. He stood quietly in the driveway for a while, then said, "You still think this is about the truck?" Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. Karen's final move came the next morning in the form of a legal notice delivered via courier. She had filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Council, accusing Michael of harassment, targeted surveillance, and creating a hostile residential environment. The complaint included selective excerpts from his camera logs, records she could only have acquired through unauthorized access or third-party retrieval, and a statement from a neighbor alleging he had stared aggressively during lawn maintenance. The complaint was paper-thin, easily refutable, but it triggered an official review nonetheless. Eleanor moved fast. She filed a counterclaim citing the forged petition, unauthorized inspections, and previous unsubstantiated claims as evidence of a coordinated pattern of harassment originating from Karen. She presented a timeline, affidavit statements from neighbors who had since retracted their support of Karen's efforts, and a signed report from the community insurer stating there was no merit to the accusations. The result wasn't immediate. These things never moved fast. But the damage had been done. Not to Michael, but to the illusion Karen had carefully curated for years. The Oversight Board placed her under disciplinary review. The Housing Council dismissed her complaint, citing lack of merit and potential abuse of process. She was officially barred from submitting further complaints without corroborating evidence and third-party verification. But the real blow came from the Dues Reassessment Panel, which, after reviewing the misuse of procedural authority, implemented the full penalty clause. Karen's monthly dues were tripled for the next fiscal year, with no appeal option for 12 months. It was the clause she had once advocated to strengthen, originally meant for repeat offenders who undermine community integrity. Now, it bore her name in its enforcement log. Michael didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He quietly reviewed his security footage one last time, archived the final report, and deleted the extra backups. Karen's influence was broken, not by retaliation, not by escalation, but by structure, timing, and a refusal to bend under pressure. The war wasn't won through drama. It was won through discipline. The culmination of everything began not with a bang or confrontation, but with a spreadsheet. Michael received it in a plain email from Eleanor, titled simply, Confirmation of Fiscal Enforcement. Attached was a copy of the formal dues reassessment document, complete with Karen Whitlow's name in bold across the top, the tripled monthly amount, listed in the payment field, and a note from the Oversight Administrator confirming that the decision had been enacted with full procedural compliance. It was the end of a process months in the making, a consequence born not of emotion or revenge, but of her own decisions used against her with cold, methodical precision. Michael stared at the document for a long moment, not because he doubted its content, but because of what it represented. Not just the collapse of her power, but the irreversible exposure of her intent. Oh, there would be no quiet recovery from this. She was officially identified not as a leader, but as a liability. Within days, the fallout began to ripple across Windsor Pines. Karen's house, once pristine and obsessively maintained, began to show signs of neglect. The garbage cans weren't brought in immediately. The porch light bulb remained burnt out for over a week. The hedges went unclipped. Subtle indicators, but for someone like Karen, they were deafening. She had lost her leverage. More than that, she had lost the illusion that she was untouchable. Michael noticed it in the way she walked, no longer brisk and upright, but slower, smaller, with narrowed movements. She no longer met anyone's gaze, no longer held her clipboard during walks, and, most tellingly, she no longer attempted to disguise the tension in her jaw when she passed his house. Her silence had turned from strategic to strained, as if even looking at him was a reminder of everything she could no longer control. But Michael wasn't finished. Not out of vengeance, but necessity. Eleanor had advised one final action to fully sever the pattern of harassment, a community declaration of resolution. It wasn't a lawsuit or formal filing. It was a procedural maneuver, a request to the board to officially close the sequence of claims involving both parties and publicly record that no further disputes or grievances would be accepted unless introduced with legal counsel and verified. External evidence. This was the kill switch, the administrative endgame. It wouldn't just block Karen from reinitiating conflict. It would also establish that her behavior had reached a point where community oversight deemed future action invalid without legal scrutiny. It was a rare tool, buried in the governance handbook, one that few ever used because it required a majority of the board to agree that an individual had abused the framework itself. But with the documentation Michael had collected, the violations already enforced, and the quiet but growing support of neighbors weary of Karen's tactics, it passed unanimously. The notice was sent to her via certified mail. Michael never saw her reaction. But what he did see, a few days later, was her car packed. Boxes in the back seat, the trunk partially open, the curtains in her front windows pulled halfway down. She hadn't listed the house publicly, at least not yet, but the message was clear. She was leaving, maybe not today, maybe not even this month, but she had started the process. Her presence in Windsor Pines had always been about dominance through proximity. Once that was gone, the neighborhood became foreign to her. It wasn't just about losing a battle. It was about no longer recognizing the battlefield as hers. Still, it wasn't over for Michael. Quiet victory brings a different kind of aftermath. Neighbors began approaching him. Not overtly apologetic, but in that cautiously respectful way people use when they realize they've misjudged someone. Small nods, polite greetings, even a few acknowledgments about how things got out of hand. One neighbor, previously silent during the dispute, confessed that Karen had pressured him to sign the forged petition and that he had declined, only to receive anonymous complaints about his own property a week later. Another admitted that Karen had once hinted that Michael might be watching people's children too closely, a claim so absurd that even gossip couldn't keep it alive. These conversations weren't satisfying. They weren't redemptive. But they were useful. They confirmed what Michael had known all along. Karen's power hadn't come from rules or enforcement. It came from fear, from whispers, from the unspoken threat of being her next target. The board invited Michael to a closed meeting a week later, not as a reprimand, but as a courtesy. They thanked him for his patience, for his documentation, and, most of all, for not allowing the situation to spiral into public spectacle. One of the older board members, a man named Lionel who had served through 3 previous community administrations, pulled Michael aside afterward and said, "You did what we all should have done years ago. You didn't shout. You just showed us the math." Michael nodded and left without responding. That night, as he stood in his garage, polishing the hood of his truck with deliberate, even motions, he heard Karen's door slam across the street. He looked up. She was walking to her car alone. No clipboard, no leash, no dog. Just a small overnight bag slung over one shoulder and keys clutched tightly in one hand. She didn't look in his direction. But as she reached the driver's seat, she paused. Not long, just enough. Then she got in, closed the door, and drove away. Michael watched the taillights disappear into the curve at the end of the cul-de-sac. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He simply returned to his task, the wax cloth moving in smooth, methodical circles. Because to him, this wasn't an ending. It was a correction. A realignment of what should have been maintained from the beginning. A neighborhood not built on intimidation, but on mutual accountability. By the next morning, the neighborhood message board posted a new set of procedural amendments. More transparency, more oversight, and mandatory board rotation. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but her absence was felt, and in the silence that followed, Michael understood something deeper. Justice, when applied with clarity and patience, doesn't need a verdict. It just needs permanence. In the weeks that followed Karen's departure, Windsor Pines settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the strained artificial stillness that had once hovered under her supervision, but a genuine calm, the kind that comes only after a prolonged and Exhausting storm has finally passed. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but for those who had lived under the shadow of her control, it was undeniable. People began walking their dogs more leisurely, no longer veering across the street to avoid certain eyes. Garden work resumed without whispers about hedge height or irrigation schedules. Even the board, once stiff and evasive in its communications, adopted a more open tone, sending out updates that felt more like conversation than command. Michael, meanwhile, returned to routine. He woke up each morning, brewed his coffee, and walked the perimeter of his property not out of fear, but out of habit. A habit that had once been rooted in vigilance, now transformed into simple maintenance. His security cameras remained, not as a fortress, but as tools. He updated them less frequently now, adjusted their angles only when necessary, and archived less footage. He had no illusions that the world had become safer, only that, for now, his corner of it had found balance. The neighborhood board held a meeting 2 weeks after the final amendment was passed, and though attendance was optional, it drew a larger-than-usual crowd. Michael sat near the back, not to hide, but to observe. The mood in the room was different, less formal, more curious. The new chairperson, a younger woman named Denise who had once worked under Karen's direction, opened the session with a brief statement about renewing trust and reestablishing community harmony. She didn't mention Karen's name, didn't rehash the past, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. The board presented a revised set of procedures, a transparency log for all citations, a limit on the number of anonymous reports a resident could file per quarter, and a requirement that all compliance inspections be scheduled publicly in advance. These were small steps, but they marked the beginning of a broader shift, a shift away from control by fear and into something more sustainable. Michael spoke only once when asked about his experiences. He didn't recount the full timeline or assign blame. Instead, he said, "Sometimes rules are used to build communities. Sometimes they're used to tear them apart. We have to decide each time which one we're doing." There was no applause, no grand reaction, just a long pause and a few slow nods. That was enough. Back at his house, life continued. He spent more time in his garage, finally finishing the custom toolbox mount he had been meaning to reinforce for weeks. On Sundays, he began helping a neighbor 2 doors down with their patio wiring project. Not out of obligation, but because the man had once approached him awkwardly during the conflict and said, "If you ever need a hand, I owe you one." They hadn't spoken since, but now they worked in quiet coordination. 2 men bonded not by friendship, but by shared understanding. It was enough. Michael didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. What he needed, what he had always wanted, was space. Space to live without the looming presence of someone constantly watching, judging, weaponizing procedure for personal dominance. One evening, as he was closing up the garage, he noticed a new car parked across the street. Karen's old house. The porch light was on again, but the glow was different. Warmer. Softer. A young couple stepped out, laughing about something Michael couldn't hear, and stood for a moment at the edge of the driveway, surveying their new surroundings. They looked relaxed, unaware of the history that had unfolded just feet from where they now stood. And that was exactly how it should be. Whatever had happened here didn't belong to them. It wasn't their burden to inherit. Karen's legacy wasn't the house or the trees she once trimmed with military precision. It was a cautionary tale now folded into the collective memory of the neighborhood, remembered not with bitterness, but as a turning point, a reminder of how control, untempered by empathy, can unravel even the most beautiful facades. Michael stepped back inside and turned off the porch light. He didn't look back out the window. He didn't need to. The balance had been restored, not by force, not by spectacle, but by the steady application of reason, patience, and unwavering refusal to surrender to intimidation. He had never wanted a fight. He had never sought conflict. But when it found him, he had faced it not with noise or anger, but with quiet precision. And in doing so, he hadn't just protected his home. He had changed the way the neighborhood understood itself. By the end of that month, for the first time since he'd moved in, Michael realized something strange. He no longer thought about his truck when he went to sleep. It sat in the driveway each night undisturbed, its metallic surface gleaming faintly under the security lights not as a target, but as a testament. Not to victory, but to resilience. Not to power, but to permanence.